Now for today's program. Susan Rubin Suleiman was born in Budapest and emigrated to the United States as a child with her parents. She had a long and distinguished career as a professor of French and comparative literature at Harvard University and has won many honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 1992, Susan was decorated by the French government as an officer of the Order of Academic Palms, and in 2018 was awarded France's highest honor, the Légion d'honneur. Susan has published more than a dozen books and over 100 articles in international journals, as well as book reviews in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Moment Magazine, and other newspapers and magazines. She is also the author of her acclaimed memoir, Budapest Diary, In Search of the Mother Book. Her new memoir, Daughter of History, Traces of an Immigrant Girlhood, was just published in May. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Susan Rubin Suleiman and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thanks for signing on and tuning in. Susan, it's such a pleasure to sit down with you and talk to you about your extraordinary life. I've known you ever since I was your student in the 1980s. But
That's
of course, yes, a long and happy relationship. But of course, I didn't know then that you'd been a hidden child from the Nazis in Budapest, or that you'd been a refugee from communism in the 1940s, or for that matter, that you'd been the first woman, correct me if I'm wrong about this, on the Columbia University faculty in the 1960s. And yet, with all these things that have happened to you, your memoir is not some kind of giant epic, but a slim volume. It's a series of kind of gem-like meditations on objects. So let me ask you first, by way of sliding into all this material, how did you come to sit down and write this memoir? And how did it come to take this form?
Well, like many people, around 2020, I found myself having to live with the fact that really I couldn't go anywhere except out on the street for walks. And we were, sort of imprisoned in a way with COVID. But one of the strange side effects of COVID, and I think this is probably true for many others, is that when there's nowhere else to go, you go inside, you go inward. And in my case, since I do a lot of writing, that inward journey sort of, or the turn inward, took the form of writing. I first started to write a coronavirus journal just because I didn't know what the heck else to do. And also it was the 2020 presidential campaign was beginning to heat up. And so I wrote a daily thing and I really got into it. And then eventually I found myself writing about photographs on my dresser and on my bookcase, and they were of my children, or and then older ones. And I went and got out older family photos, and I realized, I had been thinking for a long time about writing a kind of sequel or prequel or whatever to Budapest Diary, my other memoir, which was about going back to Budapest after a long time after I had left as a child. And I knew that I wanted to write something, but I based on sort of objects and not totally continuous, where each chapter would have a kind of shape of its own in addition to adding up. And this was my chance, I kind of fell into it with COVID, I would have to say. And most of the book was actually written. The first draft was written in the first year of the COVID lockdown. So that's how it happened.
So you have a nice line in your prologue, apropos of you're talking about Proust and the Madeleine and biting into how, famously he bites into the Madeleine and all his childhood comes rushing back to him. And you quote, what you say is, quote, "My imposed stillness propelled me toward my relics," which is a nice line. So I thought maybe you'd like to talk more about relics and about objects in particular, the physicality of these objects that you found and why they matter. Maybe you'd show the first photo.
Yeah, we could. I mean, of course, photos are some objects, and they're photos are fascinating because they have two things. First of all, they are objects, and you can see this is the first photo that appears in the book, and it was taken of me and my parents in the spring of 1949 when I was 9 years old. And they're relatively young still, but you can see, so here we are, this very European, I think we look very European. I don't know if that's the way you feel too, but look at my funny hairdo, that strange thing on top of my head, like a little curl on top of my head. That was like the thing for little girls in Budapest in 1949. It was called a rooster's crown. It's like the crown of a rooster on top of your head. And the funny little sausage curls, but so there's a lot to talk about what's in the photograph, what the photograph represents. But first of all, there's also the fact that the photo itself is an object. And if you look at it, you can see it has all kinds of nicks in the corner. There's a brown spot next to my father's ear. I mean, this photo has traveled. This photo has a history, and in fact, indeed, my you can imagine when we left Hungary and we had to leave in a sort of on foot, so we couldn't take much luggage, and the photos were one thing that my mother obviously and my father, but my mother packed the suitcase. She wanted to bring the photos, and so this was one of the photos that she brought along. And so that's one thing. And then obviously there are other objects. If you look at the pin that my mother has on her dress, this little flowery silver pin, that's the prologue. I mean, that pin is again a material object that I still have. And the whole story associated with it, which is, it represents, on the one hand, my mother and Budapest, and I thought it was the most gorgeous thing I had ever seen. Of course, it has no value whatsoever now. I mean, it's really not a very valuable piece of jewelry, but it has sentimental value. And the fact that it's still there, I can hold it in my hand, is very meaningful to me. And there are a few other objects. I mean, like, I also have a traveling chess set that my father bought when he knew we would be leaving Budapest. And, again, it's just like the pin isn't worth much. The chess set has a lot of pieces missing, so you can't really play with it. But it's this box, and inside it are these little teeny weeny pieces, and it was a traveling set, so there are holes, and you can put the pieces with little pegs in the holes. And the fact that it was something that I played with my father, who died not that many years after we left Hungary, 10 years after we left Hungary. So, it's just extremely meaningful to me. And it's still sitting in a drawer in my desk, even though, as I say, it's totally useless as a chess set. So that's how I think objects carry with them whole set of associations, and that's the value of them for a writer. I think is to try to unfurl all the associations that are linked to the object.
Right,
So.
right. And you have a lovely story in that same sequence about how your granddaughter, Nessa, finds the pin and says to you, why don't you wear this, Ima or Imi? And then you show her, she actually finds it in the photograph with your prompting. And
Right. I mean, she first finds it in a drawer with a lot of sort of trinkets. She loves to, rummage around my drawers. And so she found it one day, and she was 5 years old at the time, and now she's 8. But she comes to me and she says, "What's this? How come you don't wear this?" And I said, "Well, it's the corona." She called it the corona. Nobody gets dressed up in the corona. But come and look at this. So I showed it to her. On the wall is a framed picture, a slightly larger version of the one you just saw. And I said to her, "So can you find this pin anywhere?" And she, got up on a chair. She was very happy to have this little test. And there she was. She said, "Oh my God, your mom was wearing it." And, that again led to a whole set of reflections on why it was that later on, I don't remember her ever wearing it in the United States. So is it really she didn't wear it? Is it my memory that somehow has failed me there? Does the pin no longer represent any value, or did it not? Did it suddenly become how shall I say, valueless? The way I, unfortunately, when I was a child, I thought of my parents as immigrants. I didn't want us to be immigrants. I wanted us to be Americans. So to be an immigrant didn't have much value, and neither did the pin at that point. I mean, so you get
Right.
all this stuff associated with the pin. Yeah.
Right. It's funny. I don't want to be too. I don't want to put you into territory that people are very emotional about in other ways. But in some ways, this the way you're talking about objects is kind of a rebuke to the whole kind of declutter Marie Kondo ethic of, oh, just take a picture of it on your phone and throw it away. Don't keep all this stuff around. And it's interesting to think about what this means for you and so many people in the world who are displaced, who maybe objects are not just clutter, it's a
Right. The decluttering, I'm not in favor of, well, obviously we all have to declutter some things, but I have many thousands of books in my library, as you probably know. And it's very hard for me. And I moved down to Washington, to the Washington area a few years ago. And I tell you, I was not able to get rid of more than 10% or 20% of my books. And they all came with me, and I'm now thinking, what am I going to do with all these books later? But I get comfort from being surrounded by my familiar books, and
Mhm.
and so I'm not a big fan. Of course, we have to throw out things that are truly, or give them away, or so I'm not totally opposed to decluttering. I'm not a hoarder in that sense, but but I believe that it's important to hang on to the things that have meaning for you, because you never know. One day your granddaughter could be rummaging around and asking you, "Oh, tell me about this ring or this necklace or whatever," and then that establishes a real uh, continuity in between the generations.
Right. Well, to make a sort of a sideways jump off of this, you talk a lot about one of the themes in your book is how as you've had to make all these sometimes wrenching transitions, and in a lot of ways you've been forced to engage in sort of a certain amount of emotional decluttering. I mean, you write about how every time you left something behind, your way of dealing it with is to kind of slam the door on it and grit your teeth and move forward. And I wonder if do you want to talk a little bit about that? You meditate on that in the book very sensitively. What that's cost you.
Right, right. Well, some of the objects, we could even begin with that. Some of the objects that I write about, I mean, every chapter has an object as a title. So some of the objects I no longer have and will never be able to have, like, okay, the red bicycle that I received for my 10th birthday, and which I had wanted and yearned for months. I really wanted this beautiful red bicycle. I had seen somebody else riding it, someone like it, and I was begging my mother and my aunt, "Please, I want one for my birthday," and so on. So I got this gorgeous red bicycle for my birthday. It was in July of 1949, and in August 1949, we crossed on foot into Czechoslovakia. So clearly we were not taking the red bicycle. And the red bicycle then becomes a memory object. I mean, it was a very significant object, but it no longer exists except in my memory. And so to, and there are other things as well. A St. Christopher medal that I went to a school with nuns, a Catholic school with nuns in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, for a semester on our way to the United States. And I loved the nuns. They were great teachers. And, and when I told them we were leaving, they gave me all kinds, little saints pictures and a St. Christopher medal, because St. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers. And, I kept that little medal for several months, even though, I came from but my father was an Orthodox rabbi, I mean, by training. So, I obviously didn't tell him that I was carrying around a St. Christopher medal. But that medal too has become a memory object, because I finally realized I was only 10. No, I was 11 by then. I sort of said to myself, okay, I'm not really, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a Christian. I'm Jewish. So I threw the medal out the window of my grandmother's apartment in New York on the, 10th floor or something. And, so those are ways in which I think, in which objects can also become merely memory traces, but that are important. And you raised the question of leaving things behind. Well, these were objects that I left behind, but there is the larger issue of immigrants and refugees, and what they definitely have to leave behind. And it's linked to what I write about in the book, and in my book talks I often talk about this, about resilience. In other words, that children, which everybody agrees that being resilient is a very good thing. Now, what does it mean to be resilient? It means that you can overcome terrible things that can happen to you, traumas of one kind or another, or being yanked around from one place to another, and you kind of make your way despite these bad, quote, bad things or disturbing things that happen. And so being resilient means learning to turn the page, as the expression goes. You turn the page, you close the door. When I left Hungary, I was sure, I was 10 years old, I was certain I would never go back to Hungary. I just was
You remember
convinced.
thinking that as a child?
That's what I was thinking. We'll never come back to Hungary. And it took me 35 years to go back to Hungary. So, and that changed so many things in my life when I first went back with my two sons in 1984. But it took 35 years, because until then, I had shut the door behind me on Hungary, and especially on Budapest, because Budapest, beautiful city of which I had genuine memories. But I didn't want to have anything to do with those memories. I didn't want those memories. I as you close the door on the memories, and it was going back that opened the door. But I think it's a very common experience, though, of refugees, is this desire or this need to say, okay, I have to leave this behind, and I'm not going to think about it, because I have to go and adapt to my new world and that's what resilience is. You adapt to the new thing, and you succeed. And so I've succeeded. I'm very lucky. I feel I've had a very wonderful life, as the saying goes. And so, I can't complain. On the contrary, I feel very happy about it. But you'd have to be aware what it costs you, in a way, when you repress so many things or suppress so many things. So this book, I kind of try to come to terms with some of the cost of the resilience, you know.
It certainly
So
doesn't come across as a complaining book. That there's no doubt about that. Yeah, would you tell the story about you, almost the root of this, as you later realized, where your parents drop you at the farmyard, and then when they come back, and it's terrifying at first, and then when they come back, you've kind of moved on already.
Well, yeah, and again, that's what an experience that many children during. I never thought of myself as a child survivor of the Holocaust, because that very concept didn't even exist until the 1980s. You know, we didn't talk about child survivors of the Holocaust. We thought of Holocaust survivors as really people who had been in camps, and it was terrible. And but a child survivor, the child survived. So what is there to talk about? In fact, they're lucky. So we were lucky. I was lucky. But anyway, many children during the war, Jewish children who survived, were survived in hiding, and there's now a term for them. They were hidden children. Some children had the great good fortune to survive in hiding with their parents. That was my case for most of the time. We have to open a parenthesis. In Hungary, the Holocaust really didn't begin until 1944, until very late in the war. So in the spring of 1944, close to 500,000 Jews were deported from Hungary. It's terrible. But not the Jews from Budapest. They never got to, somehow the Nazis never got to deport systematically the Jews of Budapest. But the Jews of Budapest had other problems, so we had to go into hiding. But before we did that, and I did that with my parents, and it was like a big adventure. I was like 5 years old. But before that, there was a period when I think they couldn't be sure of what was happening. Maybe there would be deportations in the summer of 1944. And so they evidently, I never got this straight from my mother. I never really pressed her about it. And then she died and I couldn't. But they did. She took me to a farm somewhere in the middle of Hungary and left me there. And I was maybe just turning 5. I was really a little girl. And she said, okay, I'm sorry, I'll be back. But she disappeared. And the experience, what I write about is that then I'm all dressed in these little city frilly clothes, white shoes and all that. And then these geese are running after me in the barnyard. And I'm terrified of the geese. They're honking and they're running after me, and I'm screaming. And the other children there, the farmers' children, they laugh at me. This stupid little city girl who is afraid of geese. And so I run into the kitchen of the farmyard, and then I promise myself, they will never see me cry again. I'm not going to cry. And that experience, as I write in the book, kind of determined a great deal about the rest of my psychology. Because a few weeks later, my mother claimed, when I did ask her about this, I only left you there for a few weeks. It wasn't really, really very much. It was just a little bit, just a few weeks. But when she came to get me a few weeks later, there I was. I was no longer wearing my frilly white dress. I was barefoot like the other kids. I like a little pair of panties. It was summer. And when she came and hugged me, I froze up. I could barely, I sort of like, I don't need you. You left me. I don't need you. And that seems to have become as I write in the book, it became part of the way I operate in life. When something terrible happens to you, grit your teeth and move on, which again, it's good for resilience, but not so good about human connections,
It's highly adaptive, but only to certain things. Right.
Adaptive, but again, as I keep saying, resilience is a great thing, but But like many great things, it comes at a price, and you have to be aware of the price of resilience. Like it could make you a little bit wary of people, wary of intimacy, because you never know when somebody's going to up and leave you just when you were relying on them, that kind of thing. So that's, I think writing this book helped me to understand some of those complications.
So I don't want to I don't want to dwell on this too much longer, but there was one other passage about this that struck me, that I found very, very striking. After the war, when you and your parents leave hiding and you walk back across Budapest to your old apartment, you see all these terrible scenes in the street, the dead horses, the victims, and you come back into your apartment, which is largely still okay. And you say you'd been told every morning during this period of hiding that you had to pretend you were someone named Mary, and remember your name is Mary, and don't tell anyone your real name. And you say the end of this chapter is, you say, I am no longer Mary, but for a moment I cannot remember my name.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that, because obviously that's one of the things about hidden children. That's one of the important things about hidden children is they all, when they were in hiding, whether they were with their parents or the unfortunate ones who had to be separated from their parents for a long time, and some of them never saw their parents again. That's the terrible thing about the fate of hidden children. They survived, but their parents didn't. But all of them, all hidden children really had to pretend to be somebody else, because the one thing they could not say, and this is like no matter how old they were, is that they were Jewish, right? I mean, like that's so for the little ones, they never knew about Jewish, not Jewish, but okay. But then their problem was that they would often forget their parents. But others, as long as they were old enough, let's say 5, 6, 7, never say you're Jewish. Don't ever, no, you're not Jewish. Your name isn't, Hilda or whatever, or Annika. It's Mary. Or Christian or whatever. And then so this whole thing, I mean, of having to deny who you are. And sometimes they were so young, they barely knew who they were. They didn't even know what Jewish was, but they knew that you couldn't say you were Jewish. So, I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's just horrible. And we have many wonderful, many beautiful literary memoirs that by hidden children that uh, that talk about, how some of them were converted, during the war, and they then began to feel very Catholic, or very, they took on at least temporarily, this other identity completely. And I mean, I was with my parents, and so I kind of I knew, I knew that I was really not, that Mary was my name here, but I couldn't say what my real name was, but it was, and I could certainly not say that I was Jewish, but somehow being with my parents helped me to not completely, forget who I was really. But then when we went back to my apartment, there's that moment. Okay, now I'm no longer Mary, but then what am I? So this experience of what I call split selves, or troubled identity, or it could last. It could be very small, short-lived, or it could lead to really major problems, in your later life. I mean, who the heck are you? I mean, like, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a jump into the future, but just I don't usually do this in real time, but a very interesting question just popped up in the chat apropos of this. Someone asks, before you were separated from your parents, had you learned the Shema prayer? Was that something you knew already at this point of? It's an interesting question.
That's a really interesting question. One thing I can say is that we lived for in my early years in Budapest with my mother's mother, my grandmother, who played a very important role in my life because she was just this wonderful old lady who was a terrific cook. And, I still remember Hungarian cooking, but like noodles. I love noodles, all the different noodle dishes. And she plumbed with plum jam and, fabulous things that she could make. But the other thing is, I remember my grandmother teaching me the Shema, as a matter of
Wow.
fact. What I cannot swear to you is whether this was before or after, because she was there. She survived by a kind of miracle. She was not in hiding with us, and she survived the Budapest ghetto. That there
Wow.
was no
Yeah.
deportation, but there was a ghetto in Budapest very late. They established it in November of 1944. So the war was almost over, but still many Jews died in the ghetto. Many, many. If people have been to Budapest and the courtyard of the synagogue, of the large synagogue, there's a cemetery where everybody's death date is something like, November 1944, December 1944, January 1945. So, but my grandmother survived. She was in her 60s and she survived. And so I cannot swear to you that it was before the war, before 44, before the Holocaust, that she taught me the Shema, but she did. And the whole thing, I was very happy. She didn't just teach me Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the sentence. No, the whole thing. We went
Ah.
through the whole thing.
So you had something with
So
you. That's another object you kind of carried. That's interesting. One of
right,
the
right.
interesting things. I mean, you've written in various places in the book about how your father had training as an Orthodox rabbi, and you mentioned that all this time in Haiti, when you're with the nuns, all the time when you're being taught by these lovely Catholic nuns and being given a St. Christopher's medal and all these things, every morning your father is kosher slaughtering a chicken because there's no kosher food in Haiti, and it's just a wonderful sort of mix of identities. So let
Yeah.
me,
Well, he
yeah.
learned, he was not a shohet. He was not a slaughter. He didn't know that wasn't. But when we were living in Vienna after Budapest, we spent 8 months in Vienna. And when we had decided that we would go to Haiti because complicated things, my mother had a brother who was there and had a business there, and he told us, come here, I will help you. He was a wonderful man, my Uncle Nick. Anyway, Uncle Nick said, come to Haiti, come to Port-au-Prince, and from here maybe you can. And yeah, and we did. We were allowed to enter the U.S. after 6 months. Um, so then when we discovered that we would be going to Haiti instead of going to a DP camp, which many Jews after the war did, my father just decided, okay, well, that's it. There were no kosher butchers in Haiti, so he was going to learn how to become a kosher slaughterer. And he got himself this. I still remember there's another object. I mean, obviously it's long gone, but it was in a case. It was this very sharp scalpel, like a surgeon's scalpel, a knife, but very sharp, which came with its stone. And the idea is you sharpen it on the stone, and then he learned how to take the chicken and stretch its neck. You have to slice it across very,
Oh no.
very cleanly and kill it all at once. That's the whole thing, and let all the blood come out. There's the whole thing in Judaism about no blood. So he learned how to do that, and every morning for 6 months, he slaughtered a chicken, and we had a cook in Haiti, obviously, uh, and she would cook the chicken. So
Wow.
there you are.
So yes, and so to go back, that's a great story. I love it. To go back to the question about identities, which is
Yeah.
obviously the through line. So in your case, obviously there are two different happy endings occurred. One was that you did in fact move on and adopt, new identities, new names, and the other is that you really, in many ways, that became a big part of your life's work. Your scholarship was writing about identities and sort of layers of identity and how people work through those. I wonder if you want to put up that second picture of yourself as a as an American teenager with yet another name. Maybe Suzanne, you got the second picture?
There I am. Yeah.
So what's your
So
name at this point?
saw the other picture, when I had the little thing on top of my head and the sausage curls and so on. And this was me in 1956. This was my graduation photo from Senn High School in Chicago. And as you can see, I've become an American teenager. I'm wearing a nice sweater. This collar was very popular at the time. The little thing in my hair. And not only that, but this was the yearbook photo that appeared. And I have to tell you, I have a whole chapter in the book about how I made myself into this American teenager by reading 17 magazine. 17 magazine was my Bible. And I I became like an editor of the school paper, the National Honor Society, all these things from the great to the absurd, like joining the group of Sen hostesses. We showed people around the school, and you had to be a good student to do that. So there I was. I read like this perfect high school senior, and so it does certainly. I think the contrast between this picture and the other one, it speaks volumes, as they say, right?
Right.
And here I was Sue. I was Sue for a while in Chicago. My name was Sue Rubin, and then when I went to college, I became Susan Rubin. But in Hungarian, my name is Zsuzsika. So, so my name's, and in French, it's Suzanne. When I was in Haiti, so so all the names indicate all these different identities.
Different,
Yeah.
different layers. So to switch a little bit to your career, although it's still in the same ballpark. So when I first encountered you, when I was an undergraduate, you were teaching this very abstract kind of elevated literary theory, in which, I mean, really nothing could be further from this look at objects and people and psychologies. It was, but then over the years, your work became more and more focused on sort of history and individuals and what happens to them. So how did that develop? I mean, what turned you from high theory to kind of archival research, which you do now?
Yeah, maybe we can take one step back before I answer that question. I will get to it, but how did I become a professor of French literature? I mean,
Yes.
in the sense that here I was, this perfect American teenager, right, in Chicago. But then how did I go from there to becoming, to returning to a kind of European identity as well? And that was Barnard College. I mean, I have to say, Barnard really had a great impact on me. I even though I had become this perfect teenager, I decided to apply to college on the East Coast, where we had landed originally in New York. So, in a way, I was a perfect American teenager, but I was already slightly resisting that identity. So I came east again. I came east to Barnard, and at Barnard I discovered the big wide world, European history, which I had never studied in detail, even in high school, and above all, European literature. I mean, like Thomas Mann became my idol for a long time, and even though I was a chemistry major in the beginning, but when I discovered Thomas Mann, I just went over into literature, and after college, that was again a wonderful thing, partly through Barnard and partly through my good uncle Nick. I got to spend a year in Paris, post Barnard year in Paris, and there again. I mean, I did. As I told you, I never went back to Budapest for 35 years, but I returned to Europe in 1960 after having graduated. So roughly 10 years after I left. This was after my father had died also. Uh, I returned for a year to Europe, and that kind of again determined the rest of my life because, okay, I wasn't back in Hungary, but now I was really returning to an earlier identity as a French speaker. I knew French before I knew English. So I went back to Paris. I went back to Paris. I had
Hmm.
spent a couple of weeks in Paris on the way over with my parents, and I loved it. And so I reconnected with Europe in an interesting way. But this time it was as an American. I mean, I had an American passport. I was an American college graduate. I was no longer a refugee.
Mm.
So that chapter in my book is called, I think it's called Round Trip Tickets,
Mm-hmm.
because what I discovered is that you didn't have to close the door forever, the way I was sure that I would never return to Budapest. You could, in a way, it was a great, wonderful discovery that as I could also become, in a way, both European and American. My passport, thank goodness, allowed me to have round trip tickets. It's no longer the refugee frame of mind where you're constantly moving ahead and maybe not even sure where you will end up. But now you have more security, so you can go back and forth. And that's what I became. In the end, I became a kind of in-between person between the US and France and Europe, eventually also Budapest. But so now to answer your question, okay, well, since I had returned to France and absorbed everything French. When as I was coming into my full adulthood, as a graduate student and then as a young professor, France was the homeland of high abstract literary theory, what you're referring to as, the highest level. In other words, for a while, French structuralism was dominant everywhere, even in the American academy, in the American university. And it was great. I mean, French, structuralism tries to study literature, quote, scientifically. So, you make graphs and tables and whatever and figure out who is speaking, who is being spoken to, very complicated, interesting questions about literature. And that's what I was teaching when you became my student in 1983, I think it was.
Yeah.
So at Harvard. But then, oddly enough, in my case, what happened is that I went back to Budapest in 1984, and
Mm.
that completely changed my orientation because I began to remember. I began to what I call unforget. I began to open the door. All
Mm.
the memories came rushing back, and I began to write about it, and then to teach about the war, about the Holocaust, about memory, about war and memory. And what's really interesting, of course, is that I wasn't the only one. I mean, this in my life, that's how I could imagine it, as this is happening to me. And this is my story. And it's because I went back to Budapest with my two children and I saw the house where I used to live. But but the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is that at the same time, all over the universities, everybody began to study history. So all the other literary people who had been the high abstract theorists, we suddenly all discovered that, gee, abstract theory is fine, but there's also such a thing as the concrete. We have to figure out not just the structures of literature. How is a piece of a poem or a short story or a novel? How is it put together? Who is speaking to whom? Blah blah. But when was it? What impact did it have when it was published? What? How did the story in this book kind of not even reflect, how was it shaped by the context in which it was written? So suddenly you open up literature to the whole question of history. Nothing is literature is not written in a vacuum. And so voila, that was the entrance of the so-called new historicism into structuralism being displaced at that point, and deconstruction, which which also was a French invention, as you know, uh, uh, which were displaced by these concrete questions of, what is the relationship between what is going on out there in the real world, and this creation, this piece of literary work. And so there we are. What I thought was just my story became the whole story of everybody, working at literary studies.
Sure. Well, this is a great segue into my last question to you, and then we have a couple of interesting questions from the chat, which I'll ask, which we'll wrap up with. But my last question for you is that change you're describing in academia and the turn to history is not the only wave of change that you've been a part of. I wonder if you would tell the story of how you came to be first one of the first woman appointed to the Columbia faculty, and then, as I understand, this was after my time, the person who forced Harvard to take women's studies seriously, basically.
It's true. I forgot that. You're so right to remind me. It wasn't just from structuralism to history. There was an intermediate stage from both me and many, many other women scholars, and that was feminism, because feminism is the other thing that made us realize literature is not just all these abstract structures. It also has something to do with who is writing at what moment, and whether that person is male or female. Is that person writing about women? Suddenly, in other words, the so-called content of the work of literature and the ideology behind it, should women stay in the home? Should women do this? Should women do that? Became extremely important. So for many of us, feminism was the intermediary stage where, before we went on to history, where we suddenly realized, hey, there's more to literature than these abstract structures. There's also the body, there's psychoanalysis, there's fantasy, there's what do men dream of, what do women dream of, all these things that have to do with really concrete personal questions. And obviously, feminists usually like to joke about how we learned through feminism to say I when we were writing literary criticism, because in structuralism, it's all very abstract and you don't bring yourself into it, But when we learn to say I, this is me, this is my preoccupation. So that was a really good question, Amy. And as to the Columbia story, I mean, that was like in 1965. I hadn't even gotten my PhD yet. I was a student at Harvard, and I was doing research in Paris. And I went to a lecture by Lawrence Wiley, who was a very wonderful professor of French sociology, actually, at Harvard. But I knew him, and he was in Paris. I went, and he gave a good talk, and then I raised my hand and I asked a question, whatever, in French, because I had been doing all this work in the library. And the next day I get a call from somebody who says, well, I heard you speak at Larry Wiley's lecture, and I got your name from him later. And my name is Bert Liefrens, and I'm the chair of the Columbia College, which was a men's college at the time, college French department, and I want to offer you a job. I said, what? So I met him, and it was just a very low level job as an instructor. I mean, I didn't have my PhD yet, but at that point, he could hire me literally without going through committees or anything. Hey, this woman speaks very good French. I like the way she asked the question. She's obviously smart. Okay, let's offer. So he offers me this job, and I was going back to New York to get married. So I was very happy. And I arrive in New York a few months later, and I go and see he was still in Paris, Professor Liefman, but I went and saw the acting chair, who said, yes, I heard, yes, he hired you, very good. So you start next semester, and great. And you'll be the first woman to teach, to have a full-time appointment at Columbia College teaching men? I said, yes, I right, wonderful. And we were chatting away in French and so on. And then I'm saying goodbye. And he says, and by the way, you realize there's no future for you here. Uh, Actually, in 1960, at the end of 1965, in December or whatever, January 66, a professor at Columbia could say to a young woman who was hired, who his colleague had hired, um, there's no future for you here. And I said, what did I say? I said, I realize there's no future for me here. So I'm very happy to have this job, and and in fact, there was no future for me at Con.
But elsewhere.
But
Yeah.
isn't that extraordinary? I mean, it's
that's a
just,
great story.
yeah,
So long ago. It's,
yeah.
I mean,
But on the other hand, the other guy could offer me a job because he because he didn't have to get anybody's permission. So it was a different age. It was a different world in those days.
well, I guess an
Yeah,
academic would say that history is very contingent on these little things, right? It's all
yeah,
these
yeah,
individuals doing strange things. I mean,
right.
I would love to ask more about this, and I would love you to tell the story, but I think we might want to take some of the questions from the Q&A, and I'm going to ask the easiest one first because one reader just wants to know which Thomas Mann novel struck you the most. So that's a quick answer, right?
Well, okay. The one that I read, which absolutely blew me away when I was about a sophomore, I think it was The Magic Mountain. I mean, that is just the thing about Thomas Mann that I found is that he makes you feel intelligent because he's so intelligent himself. And so all the things he writes about, you say, oh my God, yes, that's really right. These are important questions. So I, the Magic Mountain. And then the other one was equally mind blowing to me was Dr. Faustus, which is, is the Faust myth, which I had studied in a course on the Faust myth. And it's just an incredible story. And again, I felt so smart because he told me all about the development of music because the main character in Dr. Faustus is a composer who sells his soul to the devil. But Thomas Mann, in the meantime, introduced me to the concept of counterpoint and from Bach to Beethoven. Whatever. I mean, it was really, but I just thought he was the cat's meow. He was and he represented Europe.
Yeah. Well, I just want to take a personal privilege point here and say that in a recent conversation with one of my college age children, you were talking about Thomas Mann and you mentioned the Magic Mountain, and he said to me afterwards, oh boy, I can see that's got to be my next book. So you are, as a professor,
I'm influencing your child.
You're continuing to influence my children and others. We have another question, and actually a couple of different people asked versions of this. So I'll ask it as a wrap up. Do you think that there were specific sort of socio-political or other aspects, sort of external aspects of America then that made it possible for you to, or easier for you to excel? And do you want to put that in the context, for instance, do you think that's still true of immigrants today, people who come here similarly situated?
Good question. Really good question. Well, one thing I'll tell you, in New York, when we arrived in New York, it was like January 1951. I was 11. I was placed into a sixth grade class. It was sink or swim. I mean, like, hey, you know what? We're not going to give you the slightest advantage. You just, uh, so I had to learn English very fast. And they gave us tests. They kept testing us, and at the end of that semester, I was placed into a special class where we did, middle school, and instead of 3 years, it took 2 years. So I would say that the public school system in New York at that time was truly made it possible for children who had the intellectual and the resilience, whatever you want to call it, to really excel. Now, and I was entirely the product of public schools in New York and Chicago, which and there were other kids there, in my public in that special class of where we were doing advanced work, whatever, 3 years and two. There were kids from all over. I mean, like there were even some people who today would never be found in a public school in New York. They would probably be in some very fancy private school. Uh, so the question, so I'm very grateful to that. Now, mind you, for children maybe who had more trouble learning or did not do well on multiple choice test or whatever, uh, but even so, I mean, so I don't know how that would have worked if I hadn't been able to do that. But okay, I was lucky. I was smart, whatever. And also school had always been my lifeline, during all the times where we were displaced and here being thrown around from one place to the other. The one thing I loved was school. And so for me, school was the saving grace. I think that today I would assume that an ambitious, smart child from an immigrant family could still do well in a public school system. But I don't know enough about it, honestly. And I know that many public schools are struggling and not getting enough funding, and so I just don't know. And also, I don't know whether they really sort of try to push kids along as the way we were being pushed along, the so-called gifted, whatever. So I cannot venture to say. All I know is that I wish they would teach grammar better in public school, because like when we were being taught, we were doing diagramming of sentences, and I love diagramming sentences. I was talking to a friend the other day who's an education specialist, and she was saying, yes, that really teaches you the parts of speech, and they don't do that anymore. So maybe public schools are, need to get a little refresher, or so sorry, I can't be more specific about that. Yeah.
No, that's but it's also just, I don't want to end on a downer, but I suppose for immigrants today, it's also harder to get in the first place. It's a different set of challenges.
We're talking now about so-called legal immigrants. Now, what about undocumented kids, who come from a much more stressful environment? I mean, they have to worry about would their parents be deported. I mean, so the whole business of going to school and learning and loving school and finding school as your lifeline, maybe it's much harder. I mean, not to mention the people who are turned away at the border or placed in horrible situations. I mean, we're not even discussing the whole migrant crisis, so-called. We're just talking now about people who are admitted into the country and then welcomed into the public school system, and and I imagine they can succeed. Yeah.
So not to end on a downer. It's 5:30. Of course, as always, I wish I could talk to you for hours, and I know you have lots more stories to tell. But let me just ask you let's go with can you just tell people what your next book is, the one you're working on, because it also has these sort of interesting art and identity questions, and then so we'll end on that. If that's okay.
Well, that's interesting because my next book, for the first time in my life, in my long life, in my old age, quote unquote, I am bringing out 2 books in 1 year, which had never happened before. I've written many books, but never a few months apart. But this book that's coming out in the spring was interrupted when I wrote Daughter of History. That is, I was already working on that one, but I couldn't, during COVID, I couldn't do anything scholarly or whatever. And this book is about a Hungarian filmmaker named István Szabó, who is just a year and a half older than I am, and has made some absolutely marvelous films. And some of the viewers on the chat may have seen his film Sunshine, which is about the history of a Hungarian Jewish family over 150 years. And it stars Ralph Fiennes as, he plays three different generations of this family. It's a really marvelous film with a hugely beautiful cast. It's called Sunshine. But Sabo also made films in Hungarian, in German, a film that he made called Mephisto, which is again based on the Faust myth. It was the first Hungarian film to win the Academy Award for best foreign film, and so Sabo is very well known in Europe certainly, and many people in the U.S. have heard of some of his films, but don't know his name. But my book is appearing in a series called Philosophical Filmmakers, and the book is really about. It's called the subtitle is it's Istvan Sabo, filmmaker of existential choices, and so that's very much, very much of a piece with some of the issues that we've talked about. The choices that people make in their life that will determine the rest of their lives, and many of his films are about that as well.
Yeah, very so on brand, as they say now. Well, thank you, Susan. I just want to remind everyone also the book that we're talking about today is called Daughter of History. It's a wonderful read. I recommend it to everyone, and also looking forward to the next one. Suzanne, thank you so much for talking with us. This has been lovely. And I'll ask Suzanne to come back and wrap us up. So thank you.
Yes, again, thank you so much, Susan and Amy, for this wonderful conversation. As Amy said, Susan's book is Daughter of History. I've put a link to it in the chat. We'll be sending out a follow-up email later this week that will include a link to this recording as well as a link to the book. And please go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for next week's program, which is a wide open conversation with Tiffany Schlane. Again, Susan, Amy, thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you. Great conversation. Good questions, Amy. And thank you, Suzanne.
It's great to have your professor say that you asked good questions. That's bye-bye.
Bye-bye.